Welcome to Django on Docker. In this one, we're going to be covering the absolute basics of using Django with Docker. This is meant to be a simple introduction for those of you who have experience, at least some experience with Django, and you're really interested in using Docker. Now, it's a simple tutorial, so even if you don't have that much experience, I think you can get through it. But one of the main things here is that you've already installed Docker Desktop, as in you have this on your system. If you're on a Windows, it would be in the lower right-hand dock. And if you haven't done that yet, go ahead and check out this blog post, which correlates to this YouTube video right here. You can do those things in conjunction with each other prior to jumping into this one. This is not really about Django, so I'm going to assume that you already know a good amount about Django, or at the very least you have Django installed on your local system. And if you don't, we have all sorts of setup things that you can do to get your system set up to use Django, and including a virtual environment. In our case, we're going to be doing a pip env virtual environment. So if we take a look at the final project structure, this should look very familiar to you. It's just a basic Django project with nothing going on except there's this Dockerfile, and perhaps you haven't seen a .env file before, but that's pretty much it. So we get to do the fun part. We get to make a blank Django project and then add it to Docker. That's it. That's really all we're doing. But really, as you go forward, it's not a whole lot different than that. Sure, there's things that you have to add, but that's essentially it, which is why I'm showing you how to do the absolute basics first. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up Terminal, or of course PowerShell if you're on a Windows. And I'm going to go into my dev folder. Yes, I created this dev folder as a place to hold projects. In this case, we're going to be doing simple DJ Docker, and we're going to go into that one. You can name it whatever you like. In here, we're going to be using pip env. Now, of course, if you don't have pip env installed, you can install it with sudo pip3 install pip env. If you're on a Windows, you can omit that 3 most likely, but I don't need to install it because I already have it. So pip env install. Now there's a couple things that I want to install, but I'm going to go off of this guide here just to make sure that things don't break at all, right? Like you sometimes want to divert from guides, but in this case, I'm just going to go off of these versions here. So we've got Django 2.2, Gunicorn, no version, that doesn't matter, and then Python 3.6. Okay, so Gunicorn is what's going to allow us to run this inside of our Docker container. You typically don't want to run python manage.py, run server. You want to use something like Gunicorn. There's a lot of reasons for that I can get into another time, especially when we go into production. When you're working in a local environment like I am right now, it doesn't matter nearly as much, but it's good to see how it's set up. Okay, cool. So I've got it installed. I'm going to go ahead and activate this virtual environment with pip env shell. And now that we've got that, I'm going to go ahead and clear everything out with just clear. So I've got my virtual environment installed. If I do pip freeze, I'll see that, yeah, I've got Django there. If I list things out, I should only have 2 files right now, pip file and pip file lock. These are the only 2 important ones, Django and Gunicorn. If you don't have the other 2, no big deal. Okay, cool. So we're at a point where we can now create our Django project. This shouldn't be a new command to you. This should be something that's very common. Okay, project name, no big deal. Okay, and then we're going to run our migrations and create a super user. In this case, I'll just say CFE, just a whatever password, because we're doing tests. And then, of course, you could test whether or not you want to run the server here, but I'm not going to do that quite yet. Instead, what I'm going to do is update my settings file to a new form of debug that you may or may not have seen before. So I'm going to go ahead and open up CFE home settings.py. Okay, so if you scroll down to debug here and paste right underneath it this version of debug, and I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. Now, something you may or may not know is debug can be the number 1 or the number 0. Those equate to true and false, respectively. So this is nice because then we can create a environment variable called debug and, put it as 1 or 0 versus true or false. True or false are typically harder to extract versus just getting a number. Okay, so now let's go back into our guide. The next step is actually creating that .env file. This is an environment file that we're going to use to actually declare whether or not it's in debug mode. Now, this is not incredibly important right now. It becomes a lot more important once you go into production, when you don't want debug anymore. So this .env file is really nice for that, for local testing as well as going into production. So let's go ahead and create that. All I'm going to do here is use nano.env, and then I'm going to paste in debug equals to 1. We're going to hit Control X to save it, and then Y, and then enter. And of course, if you don't have Nano because you're on Windows, you can just create a .env file in your text editor. In my case, I'm using Sublime Text. That's how I updated my settings.py. But you could even use just a raw text file. That should be okay. Okay, the next thing is actually testing Gunicorn. Now we just need to test to make sure Gunicorn works and Django runs with it. We're actually really close to being done, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and I'm going to go into my terminal and run this out. So this is in lieu of Python manage.py run server. This is using Gunicorn instead of that command. And if I do that, I can actually go here. Notice I declared a port at the end. So 8000 is the standard Django port. You can use other ports, but if I go here, it gives me this an unallowed host. No big deal. I don't really need to worry about that because things are running, right? So if I really wanted to change this to see that initial Django project, I can just go to localhost 8000. Okay, cool. So our Django project's ready. Of course, you could build it all out right now if you wanted to, or you already have this Django project and you're just now ready to just jump into the Docker part of this. Okay, so this part's easy. I'm going to close out that Gunicorn server, and I'm going to go ahead and say touch Dockerfile, and then I'm going to go ahead and open up this directory so I can actually edit this Dockerfile. If you're on Windows, you just do II period. That will open up that directory. Assuming you're on PowerShell, I'm not actually sure if command prompt does it. Maybe you can let me know in the comments. Dockerfile, and then we open it up in Sublime Text. Of course, I don't have anything in this Docker file, so let's go ahead and add some stuff. Now, what do I need to add? Well, it's pretty easy. I'm going to go ahead and copy it directly from here. This is a ready-to-use Docker file. I paste this in, and we should be able to run this right now. All right, so just a quick recap of what these things are, because I want you to get very familiar with Docker. That's coming from the Python 3.6 pre-built image that Docker has created. I believe it's Docker at least. And then it makes a directory called app. This is the directory that we want to actually put our code into. And then we also want to declare that we are going to make that our working directory. It's possible that this is actually a little redundant, but I just wanted to run it to make sure that that directory actually exists. And then we also want to make sure it's the working directory will be in, which we'll take a look at in just a moment too, to see and verify what this working directory is. App is just an arbitrary name that I came up with. I've seen many different names here as well. And then we just want to add our current code into that directory. That's a way to do it. There is another way, and it's called copy, and you could do it just like that. I've actually found that copy doesn't work as well as add. So I use add. These are default environment variables. You don't have to worry about them, but it's something that I've been using in most of my Python projects. Cool. Next, you can actually set your env port, right? So remember how we made that .env file? This is actually where you can set new versions of that. So another example of that would be env debug equaling to 0, like if you're going into production. This could be a place to actually do that. Pretty cool. And you can also grab them with the OS .environ that will actually grab all the environment variables just like that, whether it's here or in that .env file. Next is just general system dependencies. We've seen that before. These are just Linux installs that our system needs. And then finally, we want to install pip, or rather upgrade pip, install the pip-env file or the pip-env package. So we have our virtual env. And then next we want to run pip-env install. This is running inside of our working directory, right? So that's this right here after we've already added that code. So it's going to look for the pip file that we have in our actual project, and then it's going to install it to the entire system, okay? And then finally, I expose the port 8888. Notice I put the port 8000 here. That might cause some issues. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this, and let's go to our next step from the blog post, and that's to build our image. No surprise here. So we're going to go ahead and copy this, or actually I'll go ahead and type it out so you remember all these commands, and it's docker build and then -t, the tag that we want to give it. So I'm going to do simple-dj-docker, and we're going to declare the file, which of course is the Docker file, and then we'll put a period at the very end. This is going to take a little bit of time to run. I actually haven't done it this time, if you watched my last one. So it actually will install. It takes a few minutes. I'm going to pause it in just a moment, but I do want to go and see what the actual next step is, and that's literally just running our container, and then we'll clean up. Okay, so I paused it, and it finished building. This is pretty cool. So now let's go ahead and test it out. We're going to run our container. Now there's a few different things to this. So we're going to do docker run -it -p for port, and then we're going to do 80 and 8000. Okay. So actually, let me back up a second, and we'll do 888. And then we want to declare, of course, the tag of the image that we created, which was simple, Django, and Docker, I believe. Let's just scroll up a little bit to make sure that's what we called it. And simple DJ Docker. Yeah, so it's a little bit different than the guide. So simple DJ Docker. Hit enter, and what do you know? It's running. It says it's listening at 8000, though. It's not necessarily listening at 888. So let's go back into our local host. This is the only terminal I have running, so I'm going to go ahead and refresh it in here. Can't be reached. I'm not surprised. Go into localhost, still can't be reached. Okay. And of course, you know, if I go here, still can't be reached. Now, there shouldn't be a huge surprise here. It's because of all my ports are messed up. Okay, so if we go back into our Docker file, my environment port said 8000, I exposed 888, and then I ran 888. Okay, so this second number here is for 888. Okay, so let's actually make it 888 in this call. And of course, one thing I didn't mention was why it was doing that, and that's this $ port. So this is the variable itself, and that $ is able to replace that environment variable with that command. Okay, cool. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and build it. I just pressed up a few times. It may take just as long this time around to rebuild this because our Dockerfile changed. Cool. It's done building. Now let's go ahead and run it again with that port 8888. Now if I run it, notice that it's listening on that port. It's listening on localhost. And of course the localhost is related to the container itself as well. It's not just our own local host, but the actual container too. So if I go there, hey, what the heck? It's not working. What if I type out localhost? Same thing. Well, what if I get rid of the port? And seems to be loading. Okay, so part of this, actually, let's go ahead and do 0000. There. So part of this is running this way and not having the port because of how I actually ran it and how I declared it. That's this portion right here. So port 80 is typically how web applications run. So if I wanted to have it on 8888 again, I have to shut this down with Control C a couple times and change this to whichever port I want to run locally as well. All right, so if I go back here and then do :8888, it should actually boot up in just a second. Okay, so, and of course if that's lagging like mine is, you can go to localhost as well, and in theory that should work. And it does. I just had to refresh the page real quick. And it's fast, right? So there it is running. Okay, so something that's not in the guide is I'm going to show you how to actually run this in the background. So it's basically always running until you stop it, right? It's really close to being able to do that, but hopefully you realize if this is on port 80, you don't actually need to show the port inside of your browser. You can just get rid of it. Every other port, you need to put that browser on there. And then locally, you want to make sure that you have whatever that number is exposed to that actually runs, right? So like in my case, I exposed 888, but you can use 5000. You can use 5001. So if you did 5001, you would then want to run something like 5001. But of course, I'm not actually going to do that. So let's bring this back. And yet, naturally, you would want to change this port and then rebuild the image. Like after you make changes to the Dockerfile, you absolutely have to rebuild the image like I did when the port wasn't working. Okay, but now what I want to do is actually run it in the background. And so to run in the background, we need to add this D flag in the right place. So -IT, -D, -P takes values, which are these two values right here. So we don't want it right there. And then, of course, it's the same name that we tagged during the build. So we hit enter, and it gives us back this long string, which I believe means that it has been successfully running. But let's go ahead and check it out. Right, so if I go to localhost 8888, it's running. Now, I've got into this issue before and I forget that it's running, and then I come in here and do my old thing of python manage.py run server and potentially even 8888, and no errors occur. Unlike when I run python manage.py run server on another terminal, right? They're both using port 888. And in fact, if you refresh in here over and over again, it's going to have conflicts. It's like trying to figure out which one it should be running. So just keep that in mind. That is something to be conscious of after you run this command with the D. That's often why I usually just start off with not even using the -D until I am confident that I can run this over and over again. So the question is, how do we actually get rid of that? And that's just by doing docker ps. I can grab this ID right here and do docker stop, and then that's going to stop that container. It might take a few minutes, but it will stop it, and then in here this will no longer be running, right? And if I do docker ps again, it's no longer there. And then docker images, and yes, I definitely have that simple DJ Docker in there. Now, for cleanup purposes, you can always remove this. So you can do docker and then image rm, and then that's the one that you would end up wanting to remove, but it looks like it's referencing, or something else is referencing it, so you can also just do -- force, and that deletes all these other things. And then we do docker images, and there we go. Pretty cool. You can also delete it by the ID. So I've got this one that says no tag or anything. So I'll just go ahead and do docker image remove. And yet again, I need to force it. And there it goes. So yet again, I look at my images. That's a little bit better. Again, I have Kubernetes things in here that you probably won't, and I'll keep that Python one in there. But that's it. We have successfully created a Django project on a Docker container. Now I realize it's like there's just another thing to remember while building a Docker image in conjunction with Django, but see, these things don't have to happen at the same time, right? So if you're running your local development, you can still use Python manage.py run server. And in fact, I would recommend that you should do that. This is much more for when you're starting to get ready to deploy it to a production server. Then you're going to probably want to go off of actually using the Docker side of things and test it out and make sure it's working, of course. And then you will certainly have a much better basis for moving to the next level. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe to get everything, and I will see you in the next one when we do a little bit more with Docker.